So welcome to the second annual Unity Through Diversity Forum. This was started last year by someone in our audience, co-created by a couple of seniors who have now graduated. But we wanted to continue this in order to keep these conversations going, to create a diverse understanding and humanizing way of looking at different perspectives, or humanized way of looking at different perspectives on the political spectrum. So this is continued through a coalition that I've started called Iowa High School Political Empowerment, and is co-sponsored by our moderator, his organization, American Iftar. And so, yeah, I'll just pass it on to you.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for braving the rain to attend the second annual Unity Through Diversity Forum hosted here at Central Academy. My name is Fez Zuffer, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Des Moines Public Schools District, and essentially it focuses around the mission of continuing discourse to really learn from one another and see where we all come from as a people. Now, last year's class of graduating seniors, as some of you may know, hosted the inaugural Unity Through Diversity Forum in the advent of polarizing division and political strife across America. From racially motivated protests in Berkeley and Charlottesville to student-led movements in Parkland and Santa Fe, the 2017 to 2018 school year truly exemplified what happens when the youth take action into their own hands in order to bring about positive change. In last year's event, a diverse array of issues saw discussion, but this year we've chosen to narrow the topics that will be featured in today's discourse in order to allow for more substantive discussion, listening, and understanding. And that is what today is all about. Not to debate or argue with one another, but rather to understand where we all come from on our own perspectives upon issues. The mission of today's event is to allow panel participants and audience members to listen to what others have to say, see the world through a new lens, and find ways to collaborate in order to ensure positive impact for all. Because, as we all know, what unites us is far greater than what could ever divide us. Featured on today's panel are some of Central's finest political thinkers representing the diversity of the political spectrum in which we find ourselves today. Representing the liberal end of the spectrum is Roosevelt Sr. Ben Thoma. Representing the moderate liberal end of the spectrum is Roosevelt Jr. Ellie Miglin. Representing the independent outlook is Roosevelt Sr. Jane Romp. Representing the libertarian end of the spectrum is North Polk Jr. Ryan Bird. Representing the moderate conservative end of the spectrum is Roosevelt Jr. Pierce Mansfield. And representing the conservative end of the spectrum is Lincoln Jr. Eric Acosta Mejia. Now, let me provide you with a framework of what tonight will look like. So we're going to begin each topic with providing background information about the issue at hand. Then two panel members will provide 1 to 2 minute prepared statements iterating their positions and stances on the problem. Afterward, I'll ask a question related to the issue that will be open to all members of the panel and will be facilitated as a 5-minute discussion, allowing panelists to ask one another questions to clarify points and ideas. Note that these questions have not been revealed to panelists prior to tonight's event, so you'll be hearing truly extemporaneous discussion regarding these issues. Now, before we officially kick things off, and she doesn't know this is coming, I want to quickly take the time to recognize and celebrate Ellie, who's one of our panelists. This was an event that was started last year, but it wasn't going to happen this year until she brought it up and really pushed it forward to the administration that we needed an event like this in order to continue themes and messages of unity and harmony here at Central. And so really the reason why we're all here is definitely because of her. So I think she really deserves a round of applause. So why don't we kick things off with the domestic policy section of the forum. And for the record, I have a gavel, so every time we run out of time, I'll be hitting the gavel so everyone knows. The rights of America's incarcerated population have been up for debate since the founding of this nation, but have drawn attention especially in the last century, as our society has become more aware of the racism and abuse that plagues the prison system. How should we address these issues, and are an expansion of voting rights and privileges necessary to do so? We're going to begin with Eric.
Okay. I believe the voting rights of the incarcerated should be limited to people who haven't created serious felonies, including drug offenses with large amounts of drugs, and people who are there to sell drugs, and people who have created very vicious and violent felonies.
Thank you. We're going to pass it over to Ben.
I believe that our teachers need to be paid more because we are, sorry, here in the US, we have a problem with overcrowded prisons, and most of the incarcerated within these prisons are US citizens. And I do believe that they still have rights in prisons. Most states in the US, except Kentucky and Iowa, have enacted legislation to give felons the right to vote, regardless of the crime committed. According to the NAACP, between 1980 and 2015, the number of people incarcerated in America increased from roughly 500,000 people to over 2.2 million people. African Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rates of whites, and African Americans and Hispanics make up approximately 32% of the US population. They comprised 56% of all incarcerated people. In 2015, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health explained that about 17 million white Americans and 4 million African Americans reported having used an illicit drug within the last month. But the imprisonment rate of African Americans for drug charges is almost 6 times that of white people. So I believe for those who are in prison with a minor charge relating to marijuana offenses and charges similar to those offenses, those people should be able to vote when they are in prison because they haven't committed an outrageous crime like murder. Those who have committed serious crimes like murder, theft, vandalism, alcohol abuse, assault, and battery should be able to vote after they come out of prison, and only when they come out of prison, and they should have the okay from the prisons that they have been properly rehabilitated. We need to do a better job to reform our criminal justice system and work on fixing our rehabilitation rates, so rather than just punishing the incarcerated, we reintegrate them back into society. And that comes with funding these rehabilitation programs from the state and federal levels.
Thank you. Now we're going to open it to the rest of the floor, and this is the point where we give a question that they haven't heard before. They will have 5 minutes to respond to this question, and it'll essentially be facilitated as a discussion and a conversation. They can ask each other questions as we go along. The question is, for criminals who have committed murder or any other crime and have undermined another person's civil liberties and rights, why should they get to have their own civil right to vote, beginning now?
And I mean, I believe that they should have a civil right to vote if they are properly rehabilitated, because I think that our rehabilitation system is currently broken right now. However, I think anybody could have a second chance if they are properly rehabilitated. And so I believe that if a person committed murder and is thrown in prison and never actually reintegrated back into society, then they shouldn't have a right to vote. However, if they are properly rehabilitated, then they should be able to vote. And as an American, I think that they should be able to vote on that. So,
Yeah.
And feel free to jump in.
I agree with that statement of rehabilitation, and I also think that our rehabilitation system doesn't really exist even in the United States. It's very minuscule compared to most other nations. However, I believe the idea of murder, like committing the crime where you take someone else's life, I don't know if you should get that right to vote back, because that's something that's completely beyond the boundaries of civil liberties that we have in the United States, and it takes away someone's right to their life. So why should you get that right to vote?
Completely agree with that. That was really good.
As a citizen of the United States, you are afforded certain constitutional freedoms and liberties from the government. In fact, the main purpose of the Bill of Rights was to guarantee you certain basic rights the government could not take away. No action that the government can prosecute you on or imprison you for should be able to restrict your most basic rights. The right to vote is one of those most basic rights that is required to maintain a stable democracy. For example, should our government grow tyrannical in the future, they could use false imprisonments to restrict the right to vote from political dissidents. We see such actions in many tyrannical countries. So I would caution against any absolute notions of restricting the right to vote based on any single factor.
I'd like to ask Ben what you consider to be the level of rehabilitation, or how do you measure the progress that a prisoner has made?
Yeah, so I think that they should have like yearly checks on the prisoners, and I think like through like the rehabilitation systems, I think that they should have like classes to like reintegrate them back into society and have like progress levels of like each prison. Of course, that's kind of hard to do just because our like prisons are overcrowded right now. However, I do think personally through like if they people are making progress and becoming almost a different person than they were, let's just say like 10 years ago, now I think that could constitute somebody as being rehabilitated. Of course, we might have to like come back to it and like have a better system for that. But I think it would be better than having, like, as Pierre said, we don't really have a rehabilitation system right now in place. So,
And yeah, I agree. We don't really have a rehabilitation system. But at the same time, I don't think we can spend mass amounts of money on it to an extent, because if you take a look at, for example, Norway, they have a massive rehabilitation system, and it works fairly well. But the problem is that it costs, I believe, in the millions, like a lot of money. And another major problem with this is that their population is not nearly as large as ours, especially in prisons. So we can't expect to have a massive rehabilitation system like Norway, because we just can't afford it.
Okay, kind of going back to the original question for the racism within our system, that's the reason why we have so many prisoners, is because companies and organizations have found a way to profit off of having more people in prisons, and so they target African American communities specifically, and they create this culture where, because of the systemic disadvantages that these groups of people, just minorities in general, have to face, they're more likely to go into these crime, like, industries just because they have no way out. And so then we're targeting a community that we're already undermining, and then we're putting them in more prisons rather than rehabilitating them. And so that's why Norway, like, that's why we don't have, it doesn't seem feasible if you just look at it immediately to start doing more rehabilitation. It's because we're putting people in prison for petty crimes. We're putting them in prison for racist, and a lot of times.
Thank you. If you'd like to finish your thought, actually, go ahead.
Okay. Well, it's just like, that's why we don't, it's just we have a lot of people in our prisons when they shouldn't be. And we need a general reform in our judicial system.
Do I have time for a short response?
Unfortunately, have to move on. And this is just for everyone up here. As you're finishing a sentence, if I hit the gavel, please feel free to continue that thought, but then please, after that, please conclude. We're going to move on to our second topic of discussion. In the status quo, the average student feels greater exigency regarding the effects of climate change, with impact being present in the United States and around the world. With that in mind, what should be the best mode to address climate change? And we're going to start with Ryan.
When looking at addressing climate change as just a topic of a discussion, you have a topic that is extremely broad. In this way, it is important to focus the discussion in order to make it fully relevant to any single area of climate change. Before I go into this narrowing, I would first like to state my general view on climate change. Climate change, or more specifically a global warming, is occurring as a result of human activity. Carbon emissions are currently on the rise and contribute to a growing rates of climate change. Indeed, a study published April 17, 2019, using the NASA Atmospheric Infrared Sounder to measure surface temperatures over a period of 14 years, found conclusively that global temperatures have been rising at an unprecedented scale. Such changes are especially shocking given the fact that the Earth should be currently in a minor ice age. This is one of many studies confirming the unprecedented nature of current global warming. Now, to focus this discussion, and given my stance, I'll move into how to reduce carbon emissions and slow the pace of warming. There are two major forms of emission in the United States. The first is in power through coal power and oil-fueled power. And the second is in regular factory emissions and just normal industrial emission. In responding to these two, for power, I would recommend a shift towards nuclear energy. Currently, nuclear energy makes up a sizable portion of the power budget of the United States, but could benefit from reduced regulation that currently holds it back from its maximum potential. Talking about factory emissions, I would recommend subsidized filters to help factory owners economically combat the emissions from their factories.
We're now going to move on to Jane.
The world scientists estimate that we have about a decade to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions to prevent dangerous levels of global warming beyond 2 degrees Celsius and avoid the worst impacts of climate change before catastrophic, irreversible damage occurs. Unfortunately, there is no one policy or deal that would be able to solve this issue. In order to start on a path towards effective, sustainable, and affordable legislation, we need to evaluate the systems in place that aid harmful practices and investigate the root of the issue. Energy use, such as power plants, vehicles, and buildings, or industrial processes such as cement, iron, or steel manufacturing, are the predominant source of emissions in the top greenhouse gas emitting countries, so focusing efforts accordingly can drive the fastest emission reductions globally. A relatively new invention called the Energy Policy Simulator allows anyone to choose a package of energy policies and immediately see the impact on carbon emissions and other pollutants. It's essentially a video game for energy legislation. It's based on a model that attempts to replicate the physical economy with detailed information from real-world assets. This was invented by Hal Harvey, who is the longtime energy analyst and CEO of Energy Innovation. In addition, the Secretary General of the United Nations Climate Change Committee is going to convene a climate action summit in September 2019 to bring climate action to the top of the international agenda. This summit will focus on the heart of the problem, the sectors that create the most emissions, and the areas where building resilience can make the biggest difference, as well as providing leaders and partners the opportunity to demonstrate real climate action and showcase their ambition. For the US, it's our job to represent at this summit and fight for proactive, realistic, and beneficial legislation globally.
Thank you. Now we're going to open it to our other panelists with the question, should we increase citizens' taxes at the state or federal level to fund these efforts? And starting off now.
I think we should. So one proposal made by the U.S. Congress now is the Green New Deal, and while that is super expensive and there are critics of that, one way we could do it, if we see this as a national crisis, we need to increase taxes just like we did in World War II. That's how we deal with this situation, because as Jane said, the most dire effects of this will happen within a decade. That means, more fires, more floods, more like melting ice caps, and even stronger hurricanes, which could have huge economic effects. And so I think it will pay off, but we have to do it right now.
You go.
I would argue that there doesn't necessarily need to be a massive increase in taxes to adequately address the threat of climate change. For example, if you look at our power industry, we're currently funding coal energy plants in order to meet our power needs. Should we instead shift towards deregulation of nuclear energy, we could expand its usage into the general power supply, and using that money, we could even subsidize filters for factories. The funds are currently there to help fight climate change. We just need to be able to reapportion our funds in unclean sources of energy to clean.
I absolutely agree, and I think rather than showing a huge increase in taxes for everyday Americans, rather to redistribute the taxes we are currently already taking to more sustainable, renewable sources rather than coal, like you said, would be much more beneficial than just having a huge tax increase and continue to support non-renewable energy sources.
I think one of the problems that we have, at least I see, in climate change is I feel like there's always a bar being set, and when we're going to see catastrophic change, like terrible things happen. I feel like this was set 20 years ago, it was set 10 years ago, it's being set now, and I don't think we have seen anything major really happen. Yes, the ice caps are melting, and yes, it's a problem, but do I think it's as pressing as World War II? No, I really don't. So I think that we need to focus more efforts on the economy and things like that than climate change. Do I think it's a problem? Yeah. But do I think it's as major as a problem as many people say it is today? No.
It isn't just a problem that just people say. It's that scientists have proven that will have the most dire effects within 10 years. And to just say that almost, I think we need to see this as it could be catastrophic and have a huge economic toll and even be almost, it could have a huge toll on the world, even as we know for our future generations. So I think we do need to have a cautionary, we need to have policies that address this now, and like Jane said, so.
And the nations that are going to face the most harm from this are the ones that are already impoverished and already dealing with these famines. And so it's definitely going to affect Iowa farmers too, especially with our crop rotations and how the weather is changing. Like, look at this extreme weather that we've been having recently. I've been here for only 5 years, but this is abnormal. And like, it's gonna affect us, but it's not just gonna be our summers are getting hotter. It's gonna mean that our weather is gonna be much more extreme, and it's gonna affect farmers here, and it's gonna affect people who are dying across the world.
And I agree it's going to affect people, but I think there's more important things that the nation needs to focus on right now. And I'm not saying we should cut funding for climate change at all. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm also saying a whole new deal just for climate change alone is going to waste a lot of money.
Well, currently we decreased funding for the EPA. We've been decreasing funding for a lot of organizations that have been helping it. So not increasing funding for those organizations, you're not funding those organizations.
I know we aren't, but the Green New Deal is, I believe it's by Ocasio-Cortez, and it's a new idea that may go into practice if democratic elections are victorious in the next elections.
Well, I don't think that a Green New Deal is inherently a Democratic thing. There is a lot of debate within the Democratic Party and across the aisle about this issue, and it has its own flaws itself. It's that we're getting that conversation started, and we're looking at a big, larger picture than just one policy.
I would almost argue that overdoing overdoing it when it comes to the environment is almost better than underdoing it. Because the underdoing it is rising sea levels wiping out our major industrial centers. So when you're talking about balancing policy, you always have to realize you have to err on the side of the environment in this case.
And like from the research we've seen recently, scientists are not saying, this is something we can think about in 10 years. This is something we can think about in 20 years. This is something that if we don't think about today, we're not going to have a future to think about anymore. So these policies are something that needs to be talked about. And luckily it has come to the plate, especially more with our youth, as something that's an important topic to talk about like we are today.
Thank you. Since February 2018, many of the nation's largest school districts have been gripped by teacher strikes and walkouts. From California to West Virginia, causes for strikes have largely stemmed from revocations of teacher benefits, poor salaries, and budget cuts. As our own district has struggled with budget cuts in recent years, are increases in teachers' pay warranted? And we're going to start with Eric.
I do believe teachers' pay should be higher than it is right now, especially because it is so unequal when it comes to the entire country. Small towns in Iowa have very different
Rules, yeah.
Yeah, very different rules when it comes to the teacher's pay. I think a town one of my teachers told me about where he grew up, the teacher's pay is, I think, $15,000. When in Des Moines, it's $33,532 for a first-year teacher. That inequality, especially for the life of some people, is very. It doesn't lead to a very healthy lifestyle. You have to buy cheaper foods, which can lead to a lot of health problems. And there are places like in Oklahoma where it's extremely impoverished, and most public schools, like if you were comparing Des Moines public schools to Oklahoma public schools, it's about 33,000 to 20, and the poverty rate for people for homes of 3 is 20,000. So they're just at the border of impoverished, and that is horrible for the people that are actually teaching the future. They should be paid more because they are the actual people that are helping and leading these young people at this day and age into their future.
Pass it over to Ben.
And I think that this is a topic that we can agree on at least, because I believe that our teachers need to be paid more, because we are seeing across the nations that teachers are struggling to get by, and we are actually seeing more teacher strikes across the nation, including but not limited to West Virginia, Arizona, California, Kentucky, and Oklahoma, according to the U.S. News. And in fact, according to the National Education Association, the 2017 to 2018 national average starting teacher salary was $39,249. And in our state of Iowa, the average starting salary was below that at around $37,000. And so this year, as an Iowa page for the Senate, the Iowa Senate only increased the education budget by 1% or 2%, but with inflation, that simply won't be enough, and that could actually impact a teacher's pay. And we can see that DMPS switched from the block to the period schedule for the 2019-2020 year due to budget cuts. Teachers across the nation deserve more, especially since teachers have to buy supplies for the students to even be equipped to effectively teach. Plus, they have to support themselves and their families. So when we are seeing these average salaries, it is simply not enough for a teacher to do the job effectively. And I've been seeing stories where teachers have to get 2 to 3 jobs in addition to their teaching job to even make rent or support themselves. And I actually agree with Senator Kamala Harris's plan to give a $13,500 raise over 4 years to teachers, which I think is like $315 billion over 10 years. And she would utilize the state taxes to pay for the plan by taxing the rich. So teacher pay has been declining over the years in the US, and I believe that teachers have a significant impact on young people's lives. So let's pay them what they deserve. And I actually see one of my teachers here today, and he has definitely impacted and helped my future here today. So I have to thank him, but he should also probably, or most definitely, get paid more.
So we've essentially talked about people's stances. Now we're going to ask the how. What solutions would each of you propose in order to achieve, an increase in teachers' pay, or to appease teachers who may decide to protest, as they have been, beginning now?
I think it goes back to the nation's view on our education system, specifically the lack of respect for public schools and public teachers across the nation, and it goes to our highest-ranking education officials, the lack of understanding and just the policies that are put in place that don't have full research behind them and don't reflect the beliefs and the impact of everyday Americans and everyday teachers and workers. So I think the first thing we need to do is evaluate, the price of living for teachers, the price of what they're being, because it's obviously not enough right now. So I think on the highest level, we need to evaluate, what policies we can put in place that will adequately benefit our teachers, because right now it's just kind of the lack of respect is obviously shown in the little amount that they're being paid.
I agree with that, and I do think that teachers should get paid more. And their average salary for a first-year teacher is $38,000 in the United States, and I do think it should be raised to at least $50,000 per year. But the average teacher pay, who's not at the very beginning of their year, is $58,000 in the United States, and that's actually above the average national income for a median family household. So I don't think that teacher pay in general should just be raised. I think first-year teaching should be raised, but I don't think in general it should be raised because they're already above the median average income. Also, I don't think that funding teachers is necessarily the problem with public schooling in America, because I think there is a problem with public schooling in America. I actually believe that sometimes the teachers' unions are at the heart of this issue, especially because they have blocked many steps towards progress, such as measuring teacher performance based on student performance based on pay for teachers and things like that.
And
I would almost go so far as to say that I don't think there's a single delegate here who wishes to not pay teachers more. But the matter of paying teachers more comes down to where you're securing funding from. Because current raises to teachers' salaries have largely been taken on state budgets that aren't balanced. And when a state goes too far into debt, they restructure their pension plans. So if you are just providing teachers' pay without looking at how you're going to actually provide money for it, you're giving them money now to take away in retirement.
And I mean, like, yeah, states I don't think have enough resources to pay for the teachers, and that's why we need actually more federal funding for teachers, because I've seen firsthand about how states have to have a small portion of the budget to allocate for different things like mental health, education, and that's why they're constrained. I also do think that, I mean, with teachers, yeah, it might be above the national income level, but teachers who are facing, having students with low income, they need way more resources that the teacher usually has to pay for, that the students usually don't have. And so I think, like, we also need to look at them first, especially even though it's above the national income level. I think those teachers are especially struggling because they have to pay for extra resources for those low income families, especially in rural areas.
Well, how would you effectively design such a federal grant for teachers? You've acknowledged how there's varying needs across different states and different counties for teacher pay. But when you're talking about a federal grant, you're generally talking about larger federal rules, a lot more bureaucracy, and you're losing a lot of that tax money just to the bureaucracy of spreading it to the states.
I mean, I referenced Kamala Harris's actually plan for the taxing having estate taxes for the rich, and so I think that's one way at least we could look at it. And I think I think that's a good solution because right now states' structures are limited.
I'm not necessarily even talking about like where you're getting the tax money from. I'm talking about the money you're using to even spread it out. Because when you're talking about spending federal funds to give it to teachers, you're incurring a whole bunch of extra costs. The administration of dealing with states to federal. You're wasting a lot of money in trying to create a federal program that ends up going to the states.
Well, I think it's worth it to increase teacher pay because teachers have such an impact on these students. And I also think that the federal government, they don't have to do it alone, but I think if they work with states, then it could be more successful because as Pierce did say, for states funding, it's pretty limited in what that they can have. I'm not saying that it's effective, but I'm saying they have less resources to give out than the federal government.
I do think part of the problem with the teacher pay raise, and I'll make one quick comment. I think when we try to focus on teachers too much, we honestly end up with stuff like the teacher union, which is actually harming students more with elder teachers who have stayed in there longer, making it much harder to fire him, and a lot of young, prosperous teachers are usually let go first. I think we need to focus more on the students. And I totally respect my teachers and love my teachers, but the thing about school is you're teaching students. You're not teaching teachers. You're not just giving teachers money. You're giving them money for a reason, to help the students.
Thank you. And before we continue on, Ellie had a quick note for everyone.
Yeah, so in order to increase audience participation, we wanted to allow you to ask us questions for the later half of this forum. And to just bring up any topics that you would like to hear from us. So we'll be using a remind. So the number that you would text is 81010 and the message you would write is at 28997E.
The at symbol.
Yes.
Yeah, so
Okay.
the phone number you'll be texting is 81010, and then the text message you're going to send to that number is at symbol 28997 lowercase e. Does anyone need that again? Perfect. Thank you. Okay. In the last few years, vaporizers and electronic cigarettes have become inherent within America's schools and have become extremely popular among our country's teenagers. The extent at which seniors use e-cigarettes has increased from 28% in 2017 to 37% in 2019, according to the Safety and Health magazine. What steps can schools take in order to deal with this trend? Should they? We're going to pass it over to Ellie first.
Okay. So we all know and we've all heard how vaping is bad. It's especially for teenagers because of our developing bodies. What we need to be doing on both the federal and state levels is addressing how these companies are marketing their products, because nicotine products are not going to go away. But it's what attracts these students to these products that needs to be addressed in order for real change to happen. We can't just keep blaming students for going, like, when you have advertisers who specifically want to increase the number of people that are buying their products, we can't just keep blaming our teenagers for them falling into the traps. So,
Ryan.
When we look at the issue of vaping, especially in relation to American teens, we mostly look to legislating policy that would somehow regulate or ban vaping among them. It is at this crossroad where we must examine the currently known impacts of vaping. Current science on vaping is far from any single consensus. Studies into vaping vary in results from vaping being nearly harmless to being as bad overall as smoking. Overall, in a sort of compromise consensus, I will work out the assumption that while not as bad for the body as a tobacco cigarette, a vape pen does pose a non-negligible risk to the user. In relation to regulatory laws, I propose a relatively lax vaping regulation. While I would support basic product quality assurance, such regulation would be more on the levels of any basic consumer good. Most importantly, I would continue studies into the impacts of vaping, as such studies will provide the solid basis for policy in the future. In relation to American teenagers, I would say look no further than cigarette regulation. Cigarette regulation is extremely harsh, with many warnings about nicotine and dangerous chemicals, and yet it has only grown in popularity among teens. In fact, the only noticeable decrease we've seen has come since the advent of vaping. I'd almost go so far as to say that focusing mainly on advertising will do little to impact their popularity among America's teens.
Wonderful. Since many seniors turn 18 during that final year of high school, should there be a change in the age that a person is allowed to buy nicotine products? Starting off now.
No. I think, honestly, this is kind of the consumer's decision. And if you want to waste, it sounds kind of crude, if you want to waste your money on nicotine, that's your problem. That's honestly how I view it. I am against for younger people under 18, but once you hit age 18, I don't really think it's our responsibility, it's yours. And you have to be mature and realize when you're getting this, you're wasting your money on nicotine.
I wouldn't necessarily agree with the statement that we should leave teenagers on their own and that they should be able to make those decisions, because their brain is still developing. But if you're looking at this more from just like how effective would such a age change be, I don't see much effectiveness in changing the age in general. We've seen the age of alcohol is currently set at 21, and yet underage drinking is almost limitless. It's more about the culture that is created by the item than the age set. In fact, I'd almost go so far as to say that many teenagers are more incentivized to do things that seem forbidden.
I agree with that, but I don't think the way of stopping it is raising the age. And again, this is a very hard situation to solve. I would argue almost impossible, because how do you make something not popular? Especially if you're not inside the so-called ring, especially if you're not a teenager inside it and actually using a Juul or something. How do you make that not popular?
Well, there have actually been studies for specifically cigarettes and everything. They would put, this one company, they had to put an image of what would happen to these people, and so show their tonsils being swollen and blackened and things like that. Like the gross parts of the reality of being addicted to these things. And that decreases the appeal to it, because when you see something so gross, then it no longer gets its cool effect that the culture that it's created. So you do a campaign. You fund understanding and bringing awareness to these issues.
But most campaigns have not worked and failed. In many aspects, I feel they have. I feel they have. I mean, if you look at this, Ryan mentioned earlier, the cigarette campaign. Currently, there hasn't been statistical drops in cigarettes for teens since the 50s and 60s. So I believe, I'm not positively sure, but I believe that's what you stated. Is that correct? Yes. So I believe that most campaigns are not genuinely going to work. I mean, if you watch the campaigns right now, I mean, if I watched a cigarette ad, that wouldn't convince me, honestly.
I'd like to reference a recent campaign. It's called like The Real Cost or Truth. They have a lot of commercials out right now. So a recent study by Truth, which is run by the FDA, I believe, found that it increased awareness of the effects of vaping in 12th graders from 20.8% to 37%. So that's 17% difference of 12th graders saying that they now understand the effects of vaping more. Not that they had stopped, but they have a greater understanding. And I feel like a lot of students who actively vape or use vaporizers or e-cigarettes do not understand the impact it has on their body because of like what Ellie said, the lack of like showing what had happened, especially since e-cigarettes are relatively new. Cigarettes had so much study done on them and not as much research is actively available for e-cigarettes and vapes. So I feel like campaigns like this, while they might seem to be not have as huge of an impact, they do over time, especially for people who are consuming media like we are with the Truth campaign utilizing Instagram, Snapchat, social media.
I don't think they deter anyone, especially 12th graders, from using vaping or any vaping products. I think the culture definitely needs to change, but I don't think it'll deter them. I know many underage kids that do vape and that do smoke, and they know the consequences. They've seen the consequences, and they don't care. It's an addiction. You have to help them. I don't think that there's anything gained from raising the age limit because there are people that are that age that are willing to buy them those products. And that is not a deterrent at all. What should be a deterrent or what should help is changing the culture. And I do understand that campaigns sometimes don't work and those raise awareness, but that's not going to deter kids from trying vaporizers because of the flavors, because of the cool advertisements that they have, how it's better than smoking. And I think that that what should happen is just first off in education, a change in culture, but these campaigns that you're pushing for don't or won't deter those kids from continuing to vape or smoke.
It's no secret that since the horrific shootings at Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida last year, students have helped push the issue of gun reform to the forefront of discourse, demonstrating the influence that stems from the voice of youth. Despite this rise in attention, however, it seems that at the federal level, we continuously land at a stalemate. What can we do to address the issue of mass shootings? Beginning with Ellie.
I think that once we get down to it, gun reform is not as partisan as it seems. We should be doing some basic common sense things like requiring people to obtain a license in order to purchase and own a gun and have that license be renewed. Have people go through designated outposts in order, like a passport system, to get a federal license administered by the FBI. Applicants need to pay a fee, submit paperwork, a photo, fingerprints, sit for an interview, pass a comprehensive background check, and go through gun safety training to get a gun. And gun licenses take guns out of people's hands who shouldn't have them. That promotes safety, and it'll keep the Second Amendment intact, which a lot of people use to say the left wants to get rid of the Second Amendment. That's not true. It's creating like common sense legislation. And gun manufacturers have little incentive to make their products safer. They need to close this loophole in federal oversight and allow the Consumer Product Safety Commission to ensure gun safety by making safety warnings and issuing recalls for faulty firearms. We need to end legal immunity that prevents victims of gun violence from seeking justice. While civil liability can be applied to sellers and manufacturers of nearly every product, as a result of a 2005 law, the gun industry is immune from nearly all lawsuits. The Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Pact, PLCAA, allows the gun industry to ignore public safety implications or the misuse of their products, such as gun trafficking. And finally, we need to address the boyfriend loophole. While current law forbids an abusive spouse or ex-spouse convicted of abuse or under or under a restrained order from purchasing a firearm, the same common sense rule does not extend to non-felony abuse at the hands of dating partners or former dating partners. Thank you.
So when looking at the topic of gun control, there is a lot of rhetoric going on either side as to what would be effective and what would not. I tend to go for data when it comes to gun control and how the previous implementations have gone. The infamous ban of all handguns in Washington, D.C. occurred in 1976, with a Supreme Court decision reversing it occurring in 2008. In the period the ban was operative, murders per 100,000 people jumped from 28% up to 80% in Washington, D.C. After 2008, the rate had stabilized into the mid-20s. It is especially important to note that while the rate of gun homicide were only somewhat impacted by the ban, sometimes even rising throughout the period, rates of successful self-defense plummeted. Also, it is also important to note that gun manufacturers and manufacturing in general are held under certain standards of liability. A manufacturer, for instance, cannot be held liable for misuse of their products, and that any manufacturer in that products can be misused in a variety of ways. Take, for example, a rat poison manufacturer. Should their product be used to poison another human being and misused in that way, they would not see any criminal liability. It is important that these manufacturers have certain protections and that their products have certain purposes, and misuses can contribute to many cases against them. Thank you.
Now I'm going to essentially have a similar question for everyone. You know, what can we do to address this issue? But also, in addition to that, I'm going to ask, how can we improve discourse surrounding this issue, beginning now?
So, I mean, I think for discourse, I think it's just like talking about it like we are now, especially with young people, because I think like we can see mass shootings happening all across the country, and it could impact us in the future. I think it is impacting. I think as a liberal, just clearing away some misconceptions, like I support the Second Amendment. Like I don't have a major problem with like hunting as long as like hunters follow the procedures. But I also think that hunters don't need necessarily AR-15s to shoot, right? Like we don't need that. I think we could have a ban on AR-15s like New Zealand's doing, but I do believe that like we do need like common gun sense. We have background gun checks, and we need to like close the gun show loophole where people can get holes with without a gun license. Because here's the reality: bad people are still getting guns. Like Vox literally stated that since Sandy Hook, there have been more than 2,000 mass shootings, where 4 or more people were injured or died. Nearly 2,300 people have been killed and almost 8,400 have been injured. And this isn't the most shocking fact. I think since 2013, there has only been one full week, the week of January 5th, 2014, where there has not been a mass shooting. And so I think we can all agree that mass shootings need to stop. But I believe that common gun sense will only take guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have it. So if a person should have it, then they will easily pass a gun check. I mean, again, as going to Fez's question, I think we should just like talk about it and find, common middle ground.
I have 2 questions for you, Ben, kind of based on what you said. You said that you didn't believe hunters should be able to use AR-15s. Mm-hmm. I'm actually close friends with a hunter, and he actually actively used an AR-15 with deer, because you see deer are extremely resilient animals, and they can't be incited to rage, especially if you're going to be close to a deer when hunting it. So with what research do you have that AR-15 shouldn't be used for hunting?
Well, I don't have research, but from at least my standpoint, you shouldn't hunt with a war weapon. That should be used for war, not hunting. Hunting is really a sport, it is not war. And so that, at least that's what I believe. With all respect, and I think these AR-15s are still being used to use in mass shootings. That's what they're being used for.
What do you determine as a mass?
Oh yeah, you go.
What do you determine as a mass shooting?
Okay, so according to Vox, a mass shooting was where like 4 or more people were injured or died. That's basically it.
I actually had I've seen it as 6 as a mass shooting, which kind of proves your point even more. But mass shootings aren't or don't account for most of the homicides in the U.S. So I think we should address the big part of homicides, not mass shootings that count for a small portion of the homicides. We should account for homicides that happen when it comes to gang violence.
And
that is, go.
another thing that I feel like isn't addressed that much is that a lot of this gun control processes have been applied to other countries like the UK, where actually London crime rates are higher than New York City right now, and places like Australia and countries like that. But guns are kind of part of American culture for a lot of people. So it's going to be very, very, very difficult to take those guns away. I'm being completely serious, because if you look at American culture, not here, but if you go even, I would argue, even 10 miles outside the city, gun culture becomes much more prevalent in the United States, especially the farther south you go. So I think this is not a question of when to do it, it's a question of can we do it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, but just a quick question before it goes back to you. You had mentioned that AR-15s were being used a lot in mass shootings. What statistic do you have that backs that up? Because in fact, quote unquote assault weapons only make up 12% of all gun crime. Also, I cannot think of a single mass shooting in recent memory that used the AR-15. For example, Adam Lanza used a Bushmaster bolt-action rifle.
Yeah, so I believe that the AR-15, and correct me if I'm wrong, could have been used in, I think, Las Vegas. I could be wrong on that. I don't actually have something to be used, but I know I saw on mass shootings within the news that an AR-15 had been used, especially because that actually increased, I think, maybe at like Sandy Hook, the amount of children that had been died, because with guns, at least like AR-15s, you can shoot up to more bullets in a short amount of time. And going quickly to the point, yes, Americans like, guns, but should we have guns that have been used in war? Maybe not. I mean, guns are fine, but not guns with war.
Thank you. In the last few weeks, laws and regulations regarding vaccinations have become a focal point of discussion on major media networks. It appears that a clash persists between those who assert that vaccinations must be mandatory and those who see the notion of mandatory vaccinations as encroaching steps upon privileges and liberties. Should we allow vaccinations to be optional decisions for parents? Beginning with Ryan.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily, it's very much the majority opinion that vaccinations are very effective and are actually good, especially I would say at this panel. They are revolutionary pieces of modern medicine, and it's medicine that can and does save millions of lives from horrible disease. The debate, if any does exist, most likely lies in how to enforce vaccinations and whether they should be made mandatory. Particularly relevant to this debate are the various objections available to those who wish to not vaccinate. These objections are currently on either moral or religious grounds and vary based on the state. To base my position simply, I believe that the current state of vaccination exemption is far from ideal. To go unvaccinated or to willingly refuse to vaccinate one's child puts those around the child at risk. Unvaccinated children can cause outbreaks of severe diseases, with those outbreaks especially targeting those who are immunocompromised or too young to receive vaccinations. For this reason, ideological exemptions for vaccination should not exist in their current form. The question then becomes, what of those who refuse vaccination? There is, after all, an absolute difference between banning someone from an act like murder and requiring a medical procedure of any kind. Mandatory vaccination runs into many constitutional and moral issues: patient autonomy, parental autonomy, and even basic privacy concerns. The key to resolving the issue is looking to the middle ground, finding the best way to maximize vaccination without impeding on basic freedom. In this area, there has been much progress. Proposed ideas include requiring those who refuse based on moral objections to sign liability contracts, possibly holding those in an outbreak civilly or criminally liable. Another potential solution would be to ban unvaccinated children from publicly funded schools in order to protect those who are unable to be vaccinated. Private schools, especially targeting the unvaccinated, could form to help keep those at risk away from those who are susceptible to potential disease. Again, the key to the issue is finding a middle ground that will see cooperation from all.
Pass it over to Eric.
I believe that vaccines are good. Scientifically, there aren't very many negative effects of vaccines, but I don't believe that it's a mandatory. I don't believe it should be mandatory. I believe that everybody who is required to get vaccinated or has the ability to get vaccinated should be educated if they refuse. And if they still want to refuse, that they should. It's the right if they can choose what goes into their body, they can choose what they're putting inside of them, and you shouldn't make something like that mandatory. And I also agree that you should be able to like separate people who are unvaccinated from people who are vaccinated just for that risk. I think the the waiver you talked about, I don't really agree with that. But I do agree with most of your points, and I believe that vaccination is something we should look for a middle ground instead of just something that we should force on somebody else.
Is the use of religion an exemption from vaccinations a fair use of religious exemptions? Starting now.
So I actually did a little bit of research on this. And when you're talking about religion and religious exemptions, you're mostly looking at the freedom of religion guaranteed by the First Amendment. And the freedom of religion only extends insofar as you are not harming another person. For instance, if in your religion it was okay to hurt other people, your religion isn't protected in that it now harms others. In this way, choosing to not vaccinate based on religious exemptions doesn't necessarily apply to traditional governmental protections, and that you making that decision potentially harms others around you. So when we're looking at exemptions, we should really group them more into ideological than just looking at religious.
And can I ask a question to Eric? So, like, talking about, like, requirements, I know you brought that up. I don't necessarily, like, disagree with you, of course, but, like, what about parents who, like, don't want their kids to be vaccinated, but, like, the kids want to be vaccinated? What do we do about that?
So I feel like it should go to the age of consent. In some places, the age of consent is as low as 14. Some places it's 16. And if you're a 16-year-old and you want to get vaccinated, you should be. You should have the right to ask for a vaccination, since you probably know. And if you are educated on the subject and you know how it works, you should probably get. And you want to get vaccinated, you should be allowed to. We learned about this in biology, where how vaccinations work. And if you're educated on the subject, and even if you're not, if you want to get educated on the subject by your doctor, you should be allowed to. And if you want that vaccination still, you should be allowed to get it.
I would almost add that there is already current legislation on this. Up from a certain age, depending on state, your parent has autonomy, like chooses your medical decisions, and then at a certain age, you're allowed to make your own informed ones.
I think it's like 18 or something like that, but like, yeah.
There is from 16 to 18.
Well, in North Carolina, I actually want to propose this bill to Iowa, but so basically in North Carolina, they allow it for minors to get vaccinations without adult consent, and if they can do that in North Carolina, we can do that here. Yeah, that's all.
Well, so then, is it just at any time, or what do they send?
Well, when it's safe for the child, when you have a doctor saying like this is safe for them.
I also think one of the things about vaccinations is I think it's less of a problem about consensuality and more a problem about keeping people safe. Because I actually believe that vaccinations should be, like, everybody is required to have vaccinations. Because I think the risks from vaccinations are far, far less than the risks from not being vaccinated.
Make an amendment to that. People who can, because there are some people who physically can't because of other conditions. So
and like I think one of those effects, I think like there was like a growing measles outbreak in the Pacific Northwest that sickened dozens, and like the outbreak has infected at least like 36 people in Oregon and Washington, and like New York State is facing its like worst outbreak in decades. So like yeah, I agree with you how we just need to have requirements for all. Even like some parents, they'll like hold some of the children against their will, even though the children are educated. So I think we need to figure something like that.
So I agreed with your general sentiments, peers, like your general like sentiments, but I would caution against saying that there can exist some danger that would remove some right of yours. Like, for example, you have a right to basic bodily autonomy according to several Supreme Court decisions and several constitutional precedents. I don't think there's ever going to be I don't think you can ever justify removing such constitutional protections just because of some danger. And there are actions you can take in this case that do not violate bodily autonomy without just mandating vaccinations.
I agree with that, But I also think, I mean, like in some of our, we have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and like that's the Declaration. And I think life sometimes gets in threat because of not being vaccinated, because you could lose your life way easier if you aren't vaccinated. And I think that's a major problem. And I understand that there are rights in Supreme Court decisions, but I also argue that the safety of someone's life matters more than that decision.
Who determines that safety? Who would be the objective standard of how safe an action is?
And I understand what you're going to say. In this case, yes, the government would be. But the thing is that I don't think this is any step towards a overbearing thing by the government. I actually think it's a thing about safety and keeping our citizens safe.
Is safety not the first? Is that not the first precedent towards overall change in constitutional amendments, starting to make exceptions?
Would you like to answer this question, or do you want to move on?
You can go.
Okay. Well, that will conclude the focus on the domestic portion of today's forum. We're going to switch over to our foreign policy section, but real quick, for those of you who would like to submit some questions, I think we'll have time for probably 2 or 3 at most. I know that some people up here before, I think some of you came, were talking about wanting to address some issues that maybe weren't included in today's schedule, such as abortion or immigration or economic policy. So if you have questions about those, feel free to bring those up. And once again, the number that you will text is 81010. That's the number you're going to message to. And you're supposed to text to that number @28997 lowercase e. @28997 lowercase e. Feel free to send your questions as you have them. So now we're moving on to our foreign policy section. In accordance with historical trends related to colonization that have characterized recent centuries, Chinese influence in Africa has largely increased through greater investment and economic hegemony. And for our people watching at home that may not be familiar with the term, hegemony denotes, according to Google definitions, leadership or dominance, especially by one country or social group over others. So back to the question. In accordance with historical trends related to colonization that have characterized recent centuries, Chinese influence in Africa has largely increased through greater investment and economic hegemony. One practice that has become notable is the payment of African debts by Chinese nationals, expanding Chinese control over the continent. Are such policies abusing the vulnerability of the people, or are they benefiting Africa? We're going to start with Jane.
For the U.S., imperial tensions have been expressed most recently with the growing trade war with China, but China's rise as a global power has accelerated this rivalry for several years now. Beyond a struggle for mere access to resources, imperialism is the competitive drive for control over resources and markets. Africa is a critical component for China's strategic objectives for economic growth and hegemony. China's expansion across the continent of Africa has been dramatic, from trade to extraction to manufacturing. Chinese companies are responsible for approximately 12% of the country's industry, or at the continent's industry, and at a value of around $500 billion. In 2012, China became Africa's largest trading partner, and U.S.-Africa trade began to decline, with the U.S. making a sharp turn away from African oil imports to domestic productions. Arrangement made by the Premier Xi Jinping of China allowed for the development of Western multinationals and the international financial institutions, IFIs, the International Monetary Funds, IMFs, and the World Bank. The African debt crisis of the 1980s and 1990s was created by the grinding of the IFI structural adjustment programs, where loans were accompanied by harsh conditionalities of privatization, deregulation, slashing national budgets to the bone, and imposing loan shark rates of this repayment. Thus, on the heels of this recession, neoliberal policy and structural adjustment set the stage for the recovery of profitability for international trade policies that amounted to no-holds-barred assault on African working class and facilitated the current new scramble for investment in Africa and its rapid economic growth. This heightened economic development on the part of China China has raised the stakes in relations for Africa, both financially and strategically. As with the US, China's military footprint on the continent has expanded, with a new military base and growing role in the UN peacekeeping troops. These moves have greatly heightened imperial tensions between the major powers in Africa. Earlier this year, General Thomas Waldhauer testified to a U.S. Armed Services Committee that they were carefully monitoring Chinese encroachment and emergent military presence in the African nation of Djibouti. Former U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, in a March 28 visit to 5 African nations, had harsh criticism for Chinese relations in Africa, declaring that their actions encouraged dependency using opaque contracts, predatory loan practices, and corrupt deals that mire nations in debt and undercut their sovereignty, denying them long-term self-sustaining growth, and that Chinese investment does have the potential to address Africa's infrastructure gaps, but its approach has led to mounting debt and few, if any, jobs in most of the countries. This new scramble for Africa is only fueling imperial rivalries between the world's major powers, above all the US and China. The rush for profits, economic volatility, and militarization across Africa promises only instability, rising exploitation, and violence.
Your future Secretary of State. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Ben now.
And I second that. But America, I agree with Jane, and I think America cannot try to compete with China within Africa by trying to help these African countries by offering out loans. So with the data that is occurring within these countries, not only will it hurt the local economies within these countries, but I think it will hurt the global economy, especially in our globalized world today. I do believe that the U.S. cannot solely put pressure on China, especially since our trade war is hurting everyday Americans like farmers, and we can't really put sanctions on China because then there's going to be a huge negative impacts. However, I think a solution to this complex problem is having international pressure on China, using organizations like the UN to pressure China into stopping this policy, and if China doesn't really listen, which they probably won't, maybe even negotiate with China to lessen the debt put on these third world countries.
Thank you. Okay, so this one is a bit more expansive and looks at hegemony, I guess, at an international scale. How can economically stable countries such as Saudi Arabia or even the United States invest in developing nations without building economic hegemony? And if anyone would like me to restate that definition, feel free to let me know.
Okay, well, overall, we've seen a lot of trends where, specifically through using foreign aid as a form of creating proxy control in these nations, that needs to be regulated, because it's now just these larger nations trying to, they see the benefit, and so they're just going to do it. And that's a global thing, and we need to reshape how we decide why we are inputting foreign aid and to whom we're giving foreign aid.
And I agree with to an extent. However, I think that private corporations, once they set up shops somewhere outside of their home nation, for example, like some people are doing in China with businesses, which actually is seeing businesses are being set up in Africa that are Chinese. I don't think that's a problem, because actually I believe statistically these businesses are very successful in Africa, and they're helping Africans and Chinese people. My issue is when the government itself gets involved, like China has been. For example, China has been building literal islands in the South China Sea to claim more territory and to kind of enforce military rule over that area, and they're starting to do it in Africa too. So I think it's less of a problem of private corporations and more of a problem of government influence.
And I do think that maybe even answering to Fez's question, I think we could have some international trade deals, but that's not impacting serving out loans with some of these third world countries. So Obama did almost even with the TPP, but also invite some of these third world countries to come in on the table. And that could maybe challenge the Road and Belt Initiative, which I think this is solely based on, with China.
I have to completely disagree with Pierce's claim that this benefits Africans as well as Chinese citizens that are investing in Africa, mostly because of the majority of Africans that are taking out loans or investing in these programs are ending up in debt, and not just in debt, but mounting debt as a nation or as a continent, and that the corrupt deals that they're being put into with China it's undercutting their sovereignty, it's denying growth, China has the ability to address the infrastructure gap in Africa, but its approach currently is just adding to the debt.
But my question for you is it like China in general, or China's small businesses, or like businesses just moving to Africa? Because that's what I'm for. I'm not for China itself, like its government or things like that, investing completely in Africa. Because that's when I think you get a real, actual fear of imperialization. But I am for smaller businesses from China going to Africa and having their business prosper there.
China's small businesses are controlled by China. It's not like America, but small businesses are independent. I mean, China has complete control over small businesses. It's not, again, we can't come into America, but small businesses are independent. I was like, that would work. I see a logic there, but again, like China itself, the government is literally controlling these small businesses and like having direct connections with the government. So by seeing that, it literally is like the government.
Well, to kind of shift the topic of this debate a little bit, but still in the same direction, we've discussed like the U.S. approaching, or the international, or like the Western powers approaching China and attempting to work out a deal. I just don't feel that the Western nations have much of a footing to preach about Africa, because what the Western nations have done to Africa is, by its degrees, worse. They've done the exact same thing as China, and Africa still owes millions to Western bankers. And they did it when they had power. They did it when they had military power in Africa, much more so than China. I think anything you have to do is you have to try to speak reason to China rather than preaching to China about any international deal.
Who would be speaking reason to China?
I think at this point it has to be. And at this point, there might not be a perfect solution to doing it, because I don't see in what way you can force China to change its policy.
And I don't see a perfect solution either. But of course, I think at this point it's the UN that would be
but then
getting
again, China
involved.
has regularly gone against UN action.
And that's why we do we make a better trade agreement with nations. So the UN isn't always useful, but I think and it's the equal footing with these African nations, not just the Western nations telling African countries what to do. So yeah. I mean,
because when you're talking about debts from to China, they are for infrastructure. It's not like they're owing debts. China is attempting just to withhold debts from them. These have gone to roads, and these have gone to development of African cities. And while debt might be an issue, it is an issue in many modern cities.
As we move into our last few questions for foreign policy, I want to remind everyone again, we've received a couple of questions so far. I think we might have room for one or two more, so if anyone has any, feel free to send them through. Again, the number is going to be 81010 that you're going to text, and please send the message at 28997 lowercase e. At 28997 lowercase e. Okay, let's move on. Over the last decade, the South American nation of Venezuela has been plunged into an ongoing cycle of economic and sociocultural disaster, with hunger, unemployment, and crime attaining exacerbated rates in the advent of lasting corruption and unsuccessful government policies. Should the United States do anything to aid Venezuela in its economic recovery? If so, are there any conditions that should be mandated for such relief? We are going to start with Piers.
Socialism made Venezuela what it is today. Hugo Chavez in the late 1990s promised that he would create a new Venezuela through his socialist policies. He used redistribution tactics and massive spending by the government in welfare programs. This did temporarily boost some of the poor of Venezuela from 1999 to around 2010, but once oil prices dropped, the economy failed. Venezuela has a lower GDP than the U.S. did during the Great Depression, some of the highest crime rates worldwide, and starvation has the average adult losing 19 pounds per year. Nicolas Maduro, the leader following Chavez, Chavez, has worsened the situation by overprinting money to boost the sagging economy, which has led to the worst inflation in the world. Venezuela is an example of what socialism and government spending can do to a nation. Maduro has also banned any opposition to the government by imprisoning journalists that oppose him. This needs to be stopped, and action needs to be taken against Chavez.
We're going to move on to Ellie.
Yeah. Okay, so rather than blaming the issues of the Venezuelan government based just on socialism, we should be talking about the leadership's practices and his practices and use of clientelism, which is defined by Stokes 2011, is the proffering of public resources, most typically public employment by office holders in return for electoral support. We should be addressing the abuse of power within the government itself. And before the United States goes in to try to get an understanding of the Venezuelan government, we need to have a better dialogue for how we're treating these nations and their issues, and their issues are different from the United States, and just blaming it on socialism rather than looking at the policies put in place and the practices of the leader. We can't just assume that all Venezuelans are, they fell under the guise of this nutty socialist, and like even calling it all socialism. Like, I just think before the United States gets involved with trying to fix a nation, they should understand it first and the policies that got it to the place, rather than creating an umbrella term for the issues.
And I agree.
We're going to open the full conversation now. So again, another overarching question. Should the United States practice a foreign policy of interventionism or isolationism? Let's get started.
And I think it should be interventionism. And I think and I'm not using a blanket idea of socialism. I stated that they used redistribution tactics, and Maduro spent a bunch of money by selling much of the oil. Venezuela used to be the richest country in South America, and now it's one of the poorest. Socialist tactics gave that money away, and they also redistributed the wealth. But when the oil prices dropped, there was no wealth to be had because they couldn't get any wealth because all the oil was not worth anything. So they just kept redistributing money and printing money, which led to high rates of inflation, massive rates of inflation, which just destroyed their economy. And now people are starving, and it's a major problem. This isn't just a blanket idea of socialism. The policies, even Chavez himself stated that he was pro-socialist.
I'm just going to quickly jump in. Let me clarify as well. I forgot to say this earlier. When I said interventionism or isolationism, I meant through an economic lens, but also militaristic.
I have two things. First is a question, but then I have an actual statement. When has interventionism within the U.S. ever worked in his history?
South Korea, Japan. Both of those situations worked because those.
Dropping atomic bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, that ended morally good for the United States.
That's not the question we're talking about right now.
All right. Well, personally, the point I was trying to make, I think it's created more problems in the past. That's where I was coming from. But I personally think, like, with regards, I mean, we should. I'm not always for isolationist policies, but I don't think we should be completely isolationist. But I think we should apply international pressure without interfering and intervening within Venezuela's disputes. I also quickly do have to say, personally, I think that socialism could have been part of the problem, and I think socialism, pure socialism, could create more corruption. But I think it's different than democratic socialism, we can see in Norway. I know that's different, but I think democratic socialism is good, but socialism, I think it did aid to the problem just a little bit.
May I respond? Leaders from Denmark, from these nations that are socialists, have stated that they aren't socialist. The president of Denmark has stated that his country is not a socialist country. It has a freer market, statistically, than the United States. So these countries that are labeled as democratically socialist are not really democratically socialist. They have large welfare programs, but they are not democratically socialist.
Just to jump in, we spent probably a decent half of this debate focusing on the past of Venezuela, when the question's been mostly on action in the future, action currently. So I think it's important to look at present factors in Venezuela when considering whether to intervene or not to intervene. If we look currently at the opposition party in Venezuela, most of their current arguments against a revolutionary movement or a change of government have been that the opposition is sponsored by the United States government. And I would even argue that therefore any overt action by the US government would only further the opposition's claims. In order to truly gain a democratic process in Venezuela, you must have an uprising of the people, because any uprising that doesn't have the support of the people will not be successful, and it will always be from the perspective of a foreign power.
And you're
I'll go to Eric. So you set up. He wants to
So I was just gonna say that I agree with Pierce, but the thing is that he failed to say that it's not socialism; it's corruption of power that always seems to go with socialism. True socialism always has somebody that takes power. And that's not the morals of socialism, that's just what happens with socialism. It always ends up with somebody on top, their greed and their power always seems to get to their head, and they start making decisions that benefit them, but not the citizens they vowed to serve.
Also, yes, there are protests in Venezuela right now against Maduro. So I think, since there are protests and the people are openly against Maduro, I do think interventionism is not a bad idea, because we have a large base of people in the country who want aid, want help, want to stop this leader, and we aren't doing anything about it.
But intervention, when this has happened, intervention, even like this similar like scenarios in the past, it has only created more problems and more instability within those countries. That's why we go with more international pressure, like on Venezuela and on Maduro. I don't completely disagree with you, but I don't think intervention's the best recourse, because we don't know what the unintended consequences are of those.
I agree, but I think a lot of places, I'll finish up. I think a lot of times the United States leaves right after intervention. It leads to a problem. Like as seen in Vietnam. I don't think we should have gotten involved in the first place, but especially once we left, the situation got 10 times worse. And within, I believe it was 2 or 3 years, South Vietnam had completely fallen to North Vietnam. So I think when the United States actually stays in an area and not leaves it, and stays there for a fair amount of time, the situation will eventually get better, like seen in South Korea or Japan. Also, like when we pulled out of Iraq, ISIS was formed. So I don't think it's an argument of whether the United States should get involved or not. I see it as how long the United States should be involved.
Okay, we're going to move to our final question that's not an audience question. And for the final time this evening, I will quickly restate how you can submit questions in case you have any. It's your last opportunity to do so. The number is 81010, and you have to text to that number at 28997 lowercase e. At 28997 lowercase e. Okay. Since 2011, 5.6 million Syrians have had to leave Syria due to its ongoing civil war, while 6.6 million have been internally displaced. What is the United States' role in this crisis? Should Bashar al-Assad be removed from power by a US-led coalition? We're going to start with Jane.
The world is currently facing the largest refugee crisis since World War II, with the primary source of Middle Eastern refugees and displaced persons migrating from or within Syria. With so many people displaced, the Middle East has become even more stable, in addition to terror threats and other forms of instability. Past efforts from the United States to mitigate the refugee crisis in Syria have been largely ineffective for a number of reasons. Due to the burden of displaced people fleeing to other Middle Eastern nations, as well as Europe, a new security threat has emerged in that region. Iran, one of the biggest aggressors against the U.S. and a prominent enemy in that region, continues to back the Assad regime. So what actions should the United States take to combat ISIS while still aiding the refugees of Syria? In the interest of minimalizing direct U.S. involvement in the affair, 3 courses of non-interventionalist action can be offered. They are allowing more Syrian refugees into the United States after thorough vetting, offering support for NGOs, especially those that operate within Syria and the Middle East to aid refugees, and giving more foreign aid to Middle Eastern allies that take in refugees from Syria. A great number of issues exist surrounding the Syrian refugee crisis, both related to global security as well as humanitarian affairs. However, the most pressing issues for the U.S. are matters related to security. The ban on U.S. acceptance of refugees by President Trump is largely due to a concern for a potential security threat that coming from Syria and the surrounding area. Recently, matters have become more complicated due to a shift in U.S. foreign policy of non-entanglement in the Syrian civil war. That was done when President Trump ordered a missile strike against Syrian military facilities on April 6, 2017. Regardless of past actions or inactions, the U.S. now has the responsibility to engage in Syria to alleviate the refugee crisis and its causes. First, accept more refugees from Syria into the United States in conjunction with increased investigation of refugees entering the country. Second, offer financial support for those non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, operating within Syria to alleviate the refugee crisis. These organizations include, but are not limited to, the International Rescue Committee, World Vision, and Mercy Corps. A strong show of support of such organizations will also demonstrate a sense of commitment to constructive involvement in Syria to our Middle Eastern allies. Furthermore, it will allow more Syrians to remain in their homeland safely. Third, providing foreign aid to Jordan, Turkey, and other allies which admit refugees from Syria. Jordan especially is a key political ally for the U.S. in that region, and aiding them financially would indirectly increase security for U.S. interests within that geographic area. For the American people, I believe it would be most beneficial to prioritize the second policy option of local support through NGOs first, then the first solution of safe and secure refugee migration, and finally the third.
Pierce?
Bashar al-Assad and his regime have destroyed Syria. Many of the streets are now rubble and ruins of past prosperity. Syrians under the regime do not have a choice to stay in the country. They have to flee for their lives. These people are not immigrants, they are refugees. Refugees under the UNHCR in 1951 have special rights. These rights include being granted asylum. However, many European and even North American countries are not following this international law. These Syrians have a right to be allowed into France, Turkey, Italy, or the United States because they are not immigrants, they are refugees. Assad, however, if all we do is let refugees into our nation, the problem will just keep escalating. Assad needs to be stopped. He has committed war crimes against his own people, and his action should not be and will not be tolerated anywhere on this earth. America needs to take action against Assad by supporting the democratic rebels in Syria. However, America needs to stay in Syria following a war to keep troops and influence there. If America leaves after a lengthy conflict, there will be a power vacuum in a divided and confused nation where a group such as ISIS or another tyrannical leader can step in. America needs to take action, but they cannot simply leave Syria after Assad has been taken down.
The question is, the final question this evening, before we move on to our audience questions, does the United States have an obligation to accept Syrian refugees? Should we accept refugees who have been displaced as a result of U.S.-led invasions, as in Iraq?
I think so, but I think we need a good vetting process, and I think we have a good vetting process. It's pretty thorough, and it actually does a pretty good job. Like, we haven't seen many refugee terrorists. It's done a good job, period. So I think we should, just because our vetting process is good. I also think that, again, intervention never solves anything, even though there might be a power gap between that, or as you were saying, or a gap of leadership. I think whenever the U.S. has come in, it's always made things worse because there have been more resentments towards the U.S. in these countries. And so I don't think it ever works because the U.S. shouldn't be telling other countries what they should do, which leaders they should elect. It's never a good solution. So I agree with Jane in regards to we shouldn't have in these intervention policies, but we should have NGOs and refugee policies to help the situation.
I would argue that the problem that the United States has with getting involved in other countries is that in Vietnam or in Iraq, there was no clear enemy that we were fighting. There wasn't, really. There was no clear enemy that we were fighting. That was the major problem. In Syria, there is. I believe there honestly is with Bashar al-Assad and his regime. Also, I think if our war tactic should not be simply air superiority, because that's what we've done in many wars. And when we do this air superiority, we may end up bombing some innocent targets, which makes more resentment against us. This is what happened in Vietnam, except it wasn't just air superiority. Is when people would go into villages, they didn't know if they were Viet Cong or not, and they would sometimes slaughter the village. It was terrible, but again, they did it because they didn't know. We have a clear enemy in this war. But if we have troops on the ground and not just air superiority, I think we could actually solve this conflict through intervention policies.
I would argue that no matter how clear the enemy was or for what length of time we stayed in a country, we've always been unsuccessful. Look no further than Afghanistan, where we had a clear enemy, the Taliban and its leaders, and we've been there for years. In fact, we still haven't fully pulled out. As of now, the war in Afghanistan has been largely unsuccessful. The Taliban still maintains a huge presence in local governance, and currently the U.S. is negotiating with the Taliban. Or look at Iran, where we overthrew a democratically elected president and installed a Shah. We militarily backed the Shah for a long period of years, and we even had a direct enemy that we were going against. Eventually, in either country, revolutions and dissentment against U.S. rule have led to a worse situation than when we first went in.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, also, when talking about this, keeping the United States in a nation to try to aid in the process of stabilizing the country, we tried this multiple times. The Iraqi Governing Council, for example, we created a series of cabinets and like our nation to have a democratic process for these people, but it was overrun because the Iraqi people didn't see themselves represented in this. And I think that you're going to keep running into that if we keep pushing ourselves onto these other nations, that we should have a balance where we are helping, but it shouldn't just be the United States. It should be letting the people make their peace with their process.
I agree, but at the same time, unlike Iran or Afghanistan, this is a war where there is active protests against a government ruler. Unlike Afghanistan, there's active, kind of like Venezuela, there's active protests against a ruler. And I think when we're in a situation like that, where the ruler is disliked by his own people, there needs to be intervention, especially a ruler who's committed war crimes against his own people.
I would actually find that notion false. There were active protests against Taliban rule in Afghanistan. There were active protests against the Ba'athist Party in Iraq. The problem is that those protests lose steam when the opposition has a legitimate concern that a foreign power is meddling in their affairs. But anyway, switching more towards the topic of the question in Syrian refugees, I think it is important to realize that while accepting refugees is an obligation, it's also the end result will be that you're a brain drain in the country they are coming from. We must always have at the forefront of our policies a way to help make the country they are leaving a better place.
But I do think while there is protests towards the leader in Syria, I think we shouldn't be intervening within their own problems. I think there are other solutions to fix the problems. Also, I don't think if we had a leader like in the U.S. like that, I'm not saying we would, but I don't think with like another country to come in and say, hey, this is what you have to do. You know, you have to follow our rules, even though it looks very helpful. So
I'm not saying that you'd have to follow necessarily specific rules. Sorry.
You're fine.
Yeah, sorry.
We will now move to two additional questions. Because of time, I'm going to limit each one to 3 minutes of open discussion. So it'll be essentially what we've been doing all along. The first one's about abortion. What are some solutions that can deal with the pro-life versus pro-choice crisis? How do we satisfy both sides? Is that possible? Starting now.
To begin, I'd say that overall, and I don't know if this is necessarily a controversial statement, I think overall either side wants there to be as few abortions as possible in the end goal. Or whether that's because there's better sexual education, or whether that's because you no longer have those abortions allowed. I think either side can agree that the end goal is reducing abortions, and I think therefore our policy should be shifted towards minimizing abortions in ways that benefit all. For that reason, I would support programs like better sexual education and more access to birth control for those who are of poor socioeconomic status.
And Planned Parenthood offers both of those of sex education, and even the Iowa legislature this year, there was an amendment by the Democrats to offer an amendment to improve the sex education within schools. However, it did fail within the legislature and was blocked. But I do agree. I do think sex education is really important because I think that would just decrease abortions. But I think we should do it through maybe Planned Parenthood, because they have a lot of places within the United States, and they could do a lot of good within educating people and teens so they won't get pregnant and then have an abortion. But the problem is we're seeing in Missouri there's in 72 hours is not going to be Planned Parenthood anymore, and so I think then that's actually going to limit sex education and probably then increase early pregnancies and increase abortions.
Also, Planned Parenthood does more than just abortions. That's less than 1% of what they do. And so when we criminalize an entire organization for trying to help multiple issues, and then there's one issue that becomes controversial, we shouldn't be shutting down all these forums that are trying to help increase sexual education.
I would almost look more local than Planned Parenthood because different states have different priorities and different needs. For example, sexual education in Alabama is going to generally be worse than sexual education in California. And when you're looking, each individual state will have different needs, and I'd look for more state-based. And while affirmative action is divided, it's the fact that it's federally combined can sometimes limit its overall action.
What about in Iowa? We literally, the Human Health and Services budget literally cut stuff for sex education. So what can we do within Iowa, because that's been limited, and that was actually blocked by the Senate.
Well, Planned Parenthood gets is mostly a voluntary donation with a small stipend from the government. So you could just look to shifting that towards the states, a small stipend from the states with contributions from individual members in those individual states.
But what if Iowa blocks all of that, that funding towards sex education, Iowa did? What do we do then? What do we do now?
That's more of a political issue where you're trying to come to where you're trying to get everyone to agree on a single solution.
Yes, but if it's a political issue about people's basic health rights, I think, then it should be better supported federally and throughout the nation.
I have a quick response. I mean, it's more going into what individuals believe, and the solution is to try to educate people and get a general policy together.
How is abortion a health right?
Okay, we're gonna.
I know.
I'm
We're going
Parenthood. I'm talking about Planned
We're going
Parenthood.
to move on. We're going to move on. The final question this evening, before we close, is about immigration. What is the best solution to deal with the immigration crisis? Is it building a wall starting now?
No, I don't think a wall would help. It's never. I mean, I think what we need is actual reforms on immigration and improving it that way. But that's not through a wall. That's through making sure that we have more agents on our borders and more people on the borders, because there's lots of immigrants coming in, and so we need more resources on that. But I don't think a wall would help because there are underground passages that immigrants can still get through, so that's just a band-aid solution in itself. And so I think we just need to have more funding towards the immigration.
I think I actually believe that a wall would help to an extent because I don't think we have enough manpower to cover the entire border, which is a long stretch, and I think those troops should be mainly focused, like you were saying, those underground passages. I think there's a big misconception that a lot of people have. People on my side, in general, aren't against immigration. We think immigration's good, and I am pro-immigration. I want to make immigration easier into the United States, actually. I am against illegal immigration, however. So that's why I am more for the wall and that idea, and the idea of troops. That's my basic viewpoint. I'm not against legal immigration. Like I stated, I want to make the process easier, but illegal immigration is a major problem.
But the tunnels.
60% of about.
I'd like to reference a quote from President Trump that he said in 2004 during a commencement speech. Quote, "Never give up, don't ever give up, don't allow it to happen. If there's a concrete wall in front of you, go through it, go over it, go around it, but get to the other side of that wall." I think that's a beautiful metaphor. Particularly because I think the wall is a band-aid solution. It's a beautiful image that people can tack onto. This wall is going to keep criminals out. It's going to keep people out that are going to hurt the American people. But I don't think it's truly showing what the benefits of immigration to the U.S., particularly the economic benefits of immigration to the U.S., workers from Mexico and other countries as well, the benefits that has, especially on Midwestern countries such as Iowa. And I think that the wall itself is rooted in racism rather than a true immigration stance. Is rooted in this idea that specifically the U.S.-Mexico border is blocking rapists and murderers and criminals from entering the country, where a lot of Mexican immigrants are actually contributing to our workforce and our economy as a whole.
I agree, but I just want those immigrants to be legal immigrants, not illegal immigrants, because I actually do think illegal immigrants, in general, I also think we have to spend government spending on them in many particular cases, because they go to sanctuary cities, and then those sanctuary cities give them government benefits, and those government benefits they take advantage of. And again, I think legal immigration, I'm totally for. I'm totally for easier legal immigration. But the idea of, and I'm not just for a wall, I'm just for more border security. But the idea of illegal immigration being a good thing to the United States, I don't really agree with.
And I agree with that. I don't support illegal immigration.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. That was our final question. I'm going to turn it over to Ellie for our closing remarks.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you all for coming out. I know it was rough on the edges, but I think having these conversations and getting it started, no matter how small the audience is, we should be having these conversations. And so I just wanted to thank you all for coming out. And the remind that we had sent out, you can also use that to tell us what you would like to see next year, any topics that you would like to hear talked about, any just basic things that you would like to see from this forum next year. I would love to hear your feedback. So thank you.
Thank you.